Well, every decade of life has its own health issues. We have discussed the 20s through the 60s. Today we discuss the 70s and 80s with Dr. Zach Levine. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Zach.
Thanks
Great to
very
have
much.
you here.
Thanks.
Let's first of all, what is the life expectancy here in the province of Quebec for men and women?
For men, it's about 79, and for women, it's about 82.
Okay, which
So
let's
pretty
be
good.
honest, that is quite
yeah,
good.
Yeah, and it's going up for sure. It's going up everywhere, and you know that means that a lot of people are living a lot longer than that because, unfortunately, as I talked about last week, you know, a lot of young people die for stupid reasons. You know, accidents and whatnot. So there are we say a fair number of people in their 90s coming in. Sometimes who have never, haven't seen a doctor in a long time.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it means you don't need to see a doctor. Sometimes it means you really should have, but you haven't.
And I imagine moving into your 70s and 80s, you should really be seeing your doctor on a yearly basis?
Yeah, I honestly think it's a really good idea because that is the time, you want to catch things early. That's true at any time. So really, even earlier, like I said, it's good to have a doctor, it's good to have preventive health.
Of course.
But as you get older, I think it's even more important that you have someone just to follow things up. And by that age, a lot of people do have chronic issues, not necessarily serious things, but just high blood pressure or diabetes or cholesterol, and these things do need to be controlled so you can keep living well and living longer.
And we're going to talk about some specific things. First, we're going to talk about how to stay healthy and live longer. What are some of the pieces of advice you have for those in their 70s and 80s?
The number one thing is really to keep active. You know,
Right.
there's a guy the founder of City TV back in the 70s, Moses Neimer, and he says the best way to keep going is to keep going. And that's true not just physically, but also mentally and psychologically. So one of the best ways to keep your mind sharp is to keep it active.
Right.
So the old, the old model of retiring at 65 and not doing anything is not really great. You can still retire, that's fine, but you have to keep active with something that you love.
Right.
Volunteer work, doing something new, keep yourself stimulated and keep yourself happy. Because one of the things that's worth mentioning is it's not just longevity, it's quality. Quality of life
Yeah.
is so important.
Well, and a lot of people are saying now retire to something rather than from something, and that's exactly what you're saying here. All right, next is you touched on it, the importance of quality of life. Let's talk about that quality of life. How do you make sure you live a life that has that sort of quality that you need in your 70s and 80s?
One of the most important things, and I don't want to downplay, there are difficulties as you get older because, people, you may have chronic health issues like I mentioned. Loved ones may die or friends may die of your cohort, so it can be difficult. One of the most important things is having a social network.
Right.
Staying involved. So it goes back to what we were saying earlier as to staying involved. So whatever you love, if you love music, if you love knitting, if you love, it doesn't matter what, but if you find a group of people, similarly minded people, and also if you're fortunate enough to have family in town, so other generations, that's also that also helps to keep you young and keep you involved and connected.
Next is sleep hygiene. I was really surprised to see part of this was avoid napping. I imagine that as you get older, napping would be a benefit to you.
Okay, so napping is not a bad thing, and I
Okay.
think we talked about earlier, like I nap, I work overnight and I need to get a couple of hours sleep. However, if you're having trouble falling asleep at night at a certain time, like you say you can't get to sleep by 10 p.m., but you're having a 3-hour nap during the day, well, you have to cut it out,
Right.
If you want to sleep from 10 to 6 or 10 to 7, but you're napping 3 hours a day, there's a reason you're not falling asleep at 10 p.m. You're going to have to cut up that nap.
Should you schedule your sleep? You mentioned a time period, so should you go to bed at the exact same time every night? As best you can, of course.
Ideally, yes.
Okay.
And even more importantly, probably, is waking up at the same time every day. Because that's the other thing. If you're waking up later and later and later, it's not surprising that you're going to fall asleep later and later and later.
Right.
Can I mention something about Woody Allen?
Of course.
He had two lines, actually. One is, we were talking about longevity. I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it by living forever.
Right.
And the other one is, there are two types of people in the world, the good and the bad. The good tend to sleep better, but the bad tend to enjoy the waking hours more than the good.
Great lines by Woody Allen. All right, next up is sex. And in 70s and 80s, we're seeing more and more people enjoying sex in their 70s and 80s, and that number seems to be increasing.
Yeah, and that speaks to quality of life, right? I mean, if people are enjoying themselves, if they're feeling healthy, then they do the activities that they enjoy. So I think that's great. We talked about 50% of 70-year-olds having sex, and that's rising. When they survey women from the 70s to 80s, The percentage that are very satisfied with their sex lives is about 44%, and that is up between 60 and 70. It's actually 30%. So it gets better with age. People probably aren't, maybe they're not as self-conscious.
Right.
But one of the things that we talked about earlier is that sexually transmitted infections are still an issue, and maybe even a worse issue because people maybe aren't as careful. Obviously, people aren't as worried about becoming pregnant at that age, so they don't necessarily use, contraception, or at least barrier contraception like condoms. So the STI rates are rising in the older demographic.
Finally, the top causes of death, things that we should be considering. Obviously, heart attack, stroke, I would imagine, are up there. What are some of the others for people to think about?
Heart attack and stroke combined are certainly the #1, so that's why we have to keep on top of our blood pressure, on our cholesterol, our diabetes, those sorts of things. Cancer is always up there, and that's why screening is still important. That's another reason it's still important to see your doctor regularly.
Right.
And another thing that is worth mentioning that a lot of people get concerned about as they get older is dementia and Alzheimer's. And the reason I mentioned that, it is associated with death somewhat because there's an increased risk of things like pneumonia and whatnot as Alzheimer's progresses.
Right.
It also ties into what we talked about earlier, which is staying mentally active and staying socially connected. Those are two of the things that have been shown to decrease your risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia and for it to progress. So keep active and keep mentally active. That's really important.
Dr. Zach, thanks so much for joining us. It's
Thank
always
you.
a pleasure. That's a lot of information, I understand, for a lot of people out there to take in. So if there's more information that you'd like to find out about, you can visit our blog. You go to btmontreal.ca/blogs. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more Breakfast Television.